Welcome to Spirit's Journey, coming to you live on Truth Frequency Radio and simulcast on Oneness Talk Radio. Your hosts are Patrick and Catherine Andrews.
Join us each week as we explore a wide range of metaphysical topics such as dreams, astrology, intuitive readings, and life purpose. You'll receive practical guidance so that you can live your most awesome life.
Learn more about what we do at intuitiveschool.com and connect with us on Facebook at Spirit's Journey Radio. Welcome to Spirit's Journey, coming to you from Truth Frequency Radio. We also being simulcast on Oneness Talk Radio. You can find us on iHeart, TuneIn, and TalkStream Live. We're here in the Heartland, holding the energy for spiritual truth and awareness. I'm Patrick.
And I'm Catherine. Welcome, everyone.
Today, we're very excited to have Alexander Ford.
Yes, Alexander Ford is a cool guy that we met back in February at an amazing event with Jay Fizzette. So I want to tell you a little about Alexander. He is the president and CEO of Measurable Genius. It's Calgary's only polymathic services agency. And Alex has been pursuing his dream of helping entrepreneurs and business owners find their story, acquire new leads, and scale their businesses since he first became an entrepreneur at the young age of 12. So by combining strategic consulting, information tech, and marketing services, Alexander and his team convert challenges into opportunities for other experts, specialists, consultants, or gurus who've been unable or unwilling to solve. So Alex, welcome.
Welcome, Alexander.
Thanks for having me.
So I want to start off, I'm intrigued. You describe yourself as a polymathic systems thinker. And honestly, I don't know what that is. And I bet a lot of people don't. So could you explain to us what that is?
Sure. Polymath is a term that I learned from my mentor, Dr. John Demartini, and it is a more modern and scientific term for what's been called in the past a Renaissance man. It basically means an individual who understands and operates in many disciplines or areas of specialization instead of just focusing on one. I'm sure you've heard the adage, a jack of all trades and a master of none.
Of course.
But what most people don't know is it ends with, but more often than not, better than one. Meaning, if we can understand the principles that underlie multiple disciplines, if we can look for the universal principles, if you will, the principles that permeate all of the areas of specialization, common sciences and religions, then we can reveal a hidden order, or we can make connections that otherwise you might not have found looking through the narrow lens of any one particular area of inquiry or area of specialization or discipline.
Wow, that's so interesting. You know, I've kind of fancied myself striving toward being a Renaissance man. And in fact, I had an intuitive reading. It talked about my Dharma, which is kind of like, you know, what your gift would be to give to the world. And it talked about synthesis. So I kind of think of that the same way, that like I operate that way, where I'm always just diving into lots of different things, but then I start seeing all these interconnections, and then I start weaving these, you know, disparate things together, and then it becomes like this one cohesive thought.
Yeah. I mean, it's interesting that you use the word synthesis. I was at a mastermind over the weekend called Flight Club, and there was a speaker there named Alex Mendozian, and he delivers a talk that he actually shares. It's like an open source talk that he's created that other speakers and stuff can choose to also present. And in the talk, he asks the audience to select a verb, because as a copywriter and a marketer, what he found is that adjectives and nouns don't move people, verbs do. And so instead of saying, hey, who are you and what do you do? He suggests that we start with the action itself. So the word that I selected at that talk was synthesize as a verb.
Cool.
Well, and I think it's so interesting because we're entrepreneurs and we know a lot of people who are. I have found that the entrepreneurs tend to be people who are skilled at many different things. And I often, you know, have felt scattered, like, oh, I'm just supposed to focus on one thing. It seems like there's such a emphasis in our society to be good at one thing and not scatter yourself. So it's great that you're bringing this idea of the Renaissance, you know, polymathic, it back into the picture so that it's okay to be wide, talented, and have all these different skills that you bring in together. But I think the real gift is, how do you bring them all together to be effective instead of just scattering yourself?
Yeah, there is definitely some danger. I think it's easy for each of us to obviously don the rose-colored glasses when we're looking inwards towards our own behavior, and so it can be easy for us to find opportunities to justify behavior that perhaps isn't as constructive as we might be labeling it as. And so I don't want to encourage people to identify in this way to justify attention deficit issues, or like justify not really getting any one thing off the ground. Like it's pretty important that there's an intention or a mission or a structure behind the concept. That's for sure.
So, would you say that this ability to bring all of these multiple facets together into one cohesive whole, would you say that this is a rare skill that maybe a certain segment of the population has that's kind of destined to become a Renaissance person? Or would you say this is like an inherent ability that anybody could learn?
My mentor would say that every human being has every trait, and polymath is a trait like anything else. We each have, to a degree, a polymathic nature. I think our choice to identify with that nature is sort of separate from our capacity to live into it. So I would say that it's both, that each of us has the polymathic qualities to us. The question is it most constructive for each individual to focus their conscious effort in that way? Like, how efficient at managing many disciplines is this person? So I would like just to dive into the word management here for a second.
Sure.
What I have learned is that when we choose to act on a domain, whether that's business or wealth or social influence, political influence, whatever it might be, that it's ultimately our management in that domain that dictates if we'll be successful or not. So you may have heard that he who manages his money wisely will attract more money to manage.
Mm-hmm.
I think that can be expanded to he who manages his resources will attract more resources to manage. The question is, what resources do you want to attract? Because resources you attract and that you place under management, you become accountable to, and then you have to care for those. Oftentimes you'll see that there's another adage, like the two best days of a boat owner's life are the day he acquires it and the day he sells it, because they often don't realize how much work the assets we've acquired will take to keep under management. And so it's interesting to look at areas of specialization, because each area of specialization is a domain, and within that domain we accumulate resources. And the question is, how many different domains can you manage at once without any one domain falling apart? And
yeah.
It's a challenge. Like, each person has their own measure of that.
It's so interesting that you mentioned that, because that reminds me of a study that I read that was really surprising to me. They actually did a study on financial income compared to happiness. And so they found that as people's income approached $100,000 a year, that their happiness would increase. But then as they exceeded $100,000 a year, that their happiness didn't really increase anymore. In fact, as they started to accumulate more and more wealth, their happiness actually began to decrease. So there was this point of diminishing returns. And so when you're talking about the amount of energy and mental discipline it takes to manage all of those assets, that could certainly account for that decline, where people maybe reach a point where their creative faculties and comfort level and stress level and everything, their stress starts to increase with this increase in assets.
100%, particularly assets. Like, it's like the machine becomes its own fuel in a way. Most business owners I have found will start their business, or you could call them missionaries. Any individual on a mission started that mission because the mission mattered. And then they grow in their infrastructure or their organization or their team or their money, whatever it may be, like some combination of those resources, until such a point that that machine then begins to tell them what to do.
Yes.
And what I find is that if an individual follows the path of external demand, meaning the voices on the outside begin to overpower the voice on the inside. It's easy at the beginning when it's only your voice, right? You start with your own voice, you have a vision, you have a calling, you step into that, and then you accumulate team members, you accumulate customers, you accumulate market supporters and detractors, you accumulate all of these forms of feedback. If the individual doesn't empower their inner voice to the same degree as the voices on the outside grow, what we'll find is that the individual begins to acquiesce to those outside voices. The business owner begins to listen to the feedback of the customers and try to do what the customer's telling them instead of honoring their inner voice. The minute that starts to happen, the business owner is now fulfilling the needs of other people and has lost sight of their own mission and has lost that connection to that inner calling that they listened to start their business or their mission to begin with. And that's a game of empowerment. That's a game of will. It's a game of, if you want to use this language, personal development. And what I think happens is the outside world becomes a runaway train for most people.
That is so powerful, Alexander. Wow. I can see how I've done that at different times in my career for sure.
Definitely. And in fact, when you're describing that, what it reminds me of is metaphysically, we talk about how when multiple people come together, you actually start forming this group consciousness, which is almost like this separate entity, which is a combination of all the people involved. So I think that one thing that surprises people is as their business grows, like what you're describing, it's like the business starts taking on a mind of its own in a way. And I think it's that group consciousness. And then the more employees you get, their wills are all coming together and they start trying to steer the ship in their own personal direction. So I think that is kind of a surprising challenge that people find is having to, sort of manage this group consciousness energy that is forming.
100%. Napoleon Hill calls it the mastermind. And in my experience of life is undoubtedly true. And that's where the game of will comes into play. I mean, narcissists are traditionally called out, and the characteristics of narcissists overlap incredibly with the characteristics of a strong leader. And I think that there's a lot of hesitation for many business owners to exhibit the traits that are necessary for them to retain command of that growing system. But the thing is, without a visionary and without a clear vision, that system may take on a life of its own, but it won't last. And so I think that, like any asset, any resource under management, we have a duty to be accountable to that resource, else we risk losing it.
Now, just to clarify your comment there a little bit, are you actually saying that it's important for a leader of a larger organization to actually kind of bring out some of those narcissistic tendencies?
100%. And I mean, I would not label them narcissistic tendencies. I would label them necessary traits and characteristics that others who are disempowered or who are in injury or who have been hurt in the past or who don't understand or appreciate the necessary application of those characteristics may likely call them narcissistic tendencies. And I'm not saying that I support narcissism. That's not what I'm saying. I'm just saying that there's a lot of overlap in the labels that people will place upon those characteristics.
Yeah, I agree. Because I have found a lot of times people react negatively to a strong leader. But like you're describing, sometimes kind of having that strong personality is really important to hold everything together. And so metaphysically, we describe that as like a strong ego, which of course, as we all know, people can get out of control with their ego and they can sometimes become egomaniacs. They get power hungry and things like that. And obviously that's not, I believe, what you're proposing, but there is a big difference I've seen in, somebody who's a very strong leader with a clear vision. And, it is interesting bringing those qualities out, how you could almost, compare that a little bit to narcissism or something like that. But yeah, I can understand you need that strong vision to kind of keep everything moving forward.
Well, and nobody wakes up in the morning and thinks about how they can make your life better. Nobody's going to wake up in the morning and make sure that your vision becomes clearer. And ultimately, he who has the most certainty will rule the game. Like the person with the greatest degree of certainty, whether it's vision-driven certainty or emotionally driven certainty, will ultimately drive the dynamic. And so the visionary, the leader, they must remain certain or they risk, again, enabling the voices on the outside to sort of lead the way. And what we'll observe is that the people on the outside, they don't know what they're talking about. They don't have the appreciation for detail. They don't understand the nuance of the organizational structure. They don't have the same degree of wisdom and awareness about what's going on in that business. But for some reason, many business owners and leaders, myself included, in times of weakness or in times of responding to customer complaint or dissatisfaction, will often forego what we know is right in order to please or placate the squeaky wheel. And
Yeah.
and that's a game, again, that's a game of empowerment. If that visionary and that leader were truly empowered and believed in themselves, they would be able to stand and hold space for the emotions being expressed by another person without necessarily acquiescing to their demands.
Interesting, interesting. Well, I'd like to circle back for just a minute because I know a lot of our listeners are going to be interested in hearing a little bit more about Dr. Demartini because he was featured on The Secret. So, can you share a little bit about what you've learned from working from him as a mentor? Because I'm sure that a lot of people, The Secret was wildly popular several years back, and so a lot of people know about it. And I'm sure there's a lot of our listeners who just are dying to hear more about your relationship with him.
Sure, it's also interesting because he's in broader culture, he's known best for his role in The Secret. He'll often joke in his seminars that he had to package the footage that wasn't included so that he could share the secret in the secret that was left out of the secret. Um,
I'm sure.
ultimately, what you'll find is that real empowerment is not necessarily sexy. It's not necessarily a matter of, visualizing a necklace and having it appear in your mailbox. It's a question of work. It's a question of effort. And John's mission, in my observation, has been to empower individuals with the tools they need to train their intuition to help them become more empowered people so that they can expand in all 7 areas of life into greater degrees of influence and awareness according to what they value most. So he helps people to awaken to what is truly important to them. And I use the word truly because most people are convinced they know exactly what they want, but they don't have a clue. And then govern their emotions and to be in command or government, which means to be in leadership of one's own mind. Their journey of life to the best of their ability by responding to the outside world in a way that is adaptable, by discovering in their perception hidden information or hidden awareness that keeps them disempowered, and ultimately provides them with tools and a framework of questions and a philosophy of life that helps people to ultimately become awakened in their leadership, their genius, and their potential. And so when I met John in 2011, I was an IT guy. I was fairly spiritually agnostic. I need very clear, certain, and articulate process, generally speaking, to believe that something will work. I want to know that something will be reproducible no matter who does it, no matter what circumstance they're in, and no matter what questions are asked. And John was a mentor that was able to answer many of the questions that I've had in my life, and most certainly help me in my own empowerment and help me to approach my life in a way that has been dramatically more moderate in terms of my emotional volatility. And just generally, he's been a mentor who has very clearly equipped me to become a leader in my own right. So I travel the world and I've been to his seminars more times than I'd like to share. And he has just been a tremendous value for me in my own life, but also in my ability to help and to serve others while growing a team, being a good leader, encouraging the people that I care about to become more fulfilled and activated in their own lives. Like he's been a tremendous blessing for me.
So, how did you actually meet? How did you meet the icon?
I met John. I was in a networking group with an individual who had produced a movie with John in it before, and John was coming to town to do a public talk, and so I was able to get tickets through this networking group, and I just met him at this public talk. And it was an interesting journey because I'll tell a bit of a story. I had roommates at the time, and one of my roommates was registered for like an 8-week personal development intensive, and he invited me to go with him. And the interesting thing is I said yes to him because a few months prior we had done mushrooms together, and my perception on what the world was made of had changed fairly dramatically. And so I was I was sort of seeking, if you will, more than I had given myself permission to look for. So I said yes, signed up to go to this personal development intensive. And so I spent 8 weeks at this intensive, and this was in Calgary. In the last week of this intensive, we did an exercise from a book called The Passion Test. And I don't remember the exercise exactly, but the outcome of this exercise was that we were going to write a hierarchy of things that we were going to focus on or think about. I'm not exactly sure which, but I do remember that the thing that I wrote at the top of that list was to learn to listen to and to follow my intuition. Because until then, I mostly didn't even know what the word meant or cared about it, and I didn't believe it mattered anyway, right? I was just very intellectual and very mechanical about how the world worked.
Mm-hmm.
So I wrote down this objective, and a couple months later, that was in February, so March, April, John came and he delivered this public talk, and I ended up at this public talk. I had no idea who he was or what he was going to talk about or why I was going. I was just running my business, doing the networking event circuit, you know? You get a ticket, you go, you get another ticket, you go. And so I just went to this public talk. And John delivered at this public talk, like he does at every one of his public talks, a way of looking at life that just resonated with me. And just, I remember having my mind blown. And there was this moment at the end of the public talk when he was enrolling the attendees to attend his signature program, the Breakthrough Experience, that I swear to God, and I'm sure that this could be right or wrong. I mean, I look back on my memory with my own rose-colored glasses, but he looks me directly in the eyes and he says, if your intuition is calling for you to attend this workshop, I want you to come. And, you know, in my mind, I was like, you've got to be kidding me. Like this, I literally wrote this down. I said I wanted to learn to listen to and follow my intuition. My intuition is telling me to come. He's looking at me, telling me to listen to my intuition and come. Like, how can this be? This is destiny. I'm going. So, you know, I just signed up for Breakthrough. And at Breakthrough, I learned that he has an entire concourse of wisdom made up of 72 courses. And so I immediately set a goal for myself to dedicate myself to that concourse and to attend as many of those programs as I could afford. And since then, I have been a dedicated student. It was definitely more intense early on. In the first 3 or 4 years of knowing John, I think I attended somewhere between 20 and 30 of his programs all over the world. I just very intensely, you know, studied at the feet of a master and digested as much as I possibly could. And as they say, the rest is history.
So I know a lot of people have seen The Secret, and you mentioned in the beginning, he tells the secret that was not in The Secret. And I'm curious, what would you, I mean, obviously 72 lessons and all this is much deeper than what we see in the movie The Secret. Can you give us like a little nutshell of some of the bigger teachings that are left out of The Secret for people who are wanting to manifest?
Sure. I think the first and most important factor is that the conscious mind and our animal mind, or what John calls the lower mind, are separate. So what Freud calls the ego, which is different from what most people term ego, is the seat of consciousness, if you will. It's the identifying character. It's the I, Alexander. The ego is the conscious mind. It believes it's driving the bus, but it mostly isn't. You know what I mean? Mm-hmm. Like we're on this journey in a physical form, witnessing our environment and making apparently decisions, you know? But the question that John would ask and that I help my students and my clients to discover is, what factors equip or inhibit information to be received by the conscious mind? We think we're making decisions based on information we're perceiving, but as we know, the conscious mind perceives very little information. And there are mechanisms within the mind that govern how much information and what specific information is made available to the conscious mind to begin with. There's different processes going on. And so what's important is for us to understand that what we think is important may be different from what we actually demonstrate through our behavior is important. And what we think we want, or what we fantasize about, or what we have nightmares about, or what we have polarized emotions about, may be different than what our behavior consistently demonstrates is true about us. And so what we can see clearly is that there are individuals who may say they're interested in acquiring wealth or who want to be financially independent, but none of their behaviors back that up. And the question about that would be, why? Why does the behaviors we demonstrate end up being different from what we consciously express is important to us? And that sort of set of questions leads to the concept of congruence. If our conscious mind acts congruently with what our behavior demonstrates is true, then we've begun to master our lives, because we've been willing to look at and to acknowledge and to sort of bear witness to the reality of our circumstance, which is, if we wake up in the morning and we go out into the world and demonstrate wealth building activities, then we value wealth. And if we wake up in the morning and we go out into the world and we do not demonstrate wealth building activities, then we do not actually value wealth. And then the next question would be, okay, if I want to manifest wealth, then how do I do it? And that would lead us into a sort of a much deeper conversation. But the reality is, you can manifest anything you want in life as long as you start with what's actually important instead of what you think is.
Wow, very, very powerful. And that's something that I think we're going to have to pick up in the second half, because we don't quite have enough time before the break to delve into that further. But just real quick, I was curious, did you get a chance to see The Secret?
I have seen The Secret. It was one of the videos that I watched early on with my roommates.
All right. So based on your personal experience with Dr. Demartini, what would your impression of The Secret be?
I think it's it depends on where you're at, right? For people starting a spiritual journey, it's definitely inspiring. I think it definitely has the potential to awaken questions, and that the quality of our life is based on the questions we're asking. And so from that perspective, I would say it is valuable. It's most certainly not prescriptive.
Yeah. All right. Well, we are approaching the break. So we are going to be back after a short break. This is Spirit's Journey on Truth Frequency Radio, also being simulcast on Oneness Talk Radio. We will see you on the other side. Welcome back to Spirit's Journey. We are coming to you on Truth Frequency Radio, simulcast on Oneness Talk Radio. And we are here today with Alexander Ford. So, Alexander, could you just tell us a little bit about what it is that you do and how people can reach you as we get into this second half?
Sure. So, like, what we do as a verb would be, I like to synthesize systems. Traditionally speaking, business owners and entrepreneurs are faced with a very specialized economy. We talked earlier in this episode that it seems like business owners are asked to niche or niche, depending on what country you're in. We're told to pick something we're good at and go very narrow and deep with that. You see this in our education infrastructure, at least in the Western Hemisphere, where we have students going to high school, then university, and then picking a master's and then moving to doctorate. Just generally speaking, we have a society that seems to, at least for now, value knowing more and more about less and less. And that is valuable in terms of like the greater sociological benefit. Like, we benefit when someone dives deep into a subject matter, right? And that applies to me also. Like, I'm a polymath or a Renaissance man, but in order for me to be good at understanding how multiple disciplines work together, I need to at least have some access to specialized information. And I'm not going to learn that information myself. I depend on specialists to share that information with me. I mentioned I had just spent the weekend at a mastermind. An example of this would be that I run a marketing agency. We are a 7-figure business. I've got 8 team members. We serve 21 clients. And arguably, we know a lot about a lot. But there's still lots for me to learn. And it was tremendously valuable for me to have the opportunity, for example, to hear someone who has chosen to specialize in YouTube advertising share the 10 top advertising strategies that he has found in the last year of, developing his business as a YouTube consultant, right? Like, that information I need. And if there aren't specialists, we're not going to have access to that information. Now, the challenge is that most specialists are also becoming business owners because we've been sold on the idea that hustle and entrepreneurialism is the new celebrity.
Mhm.
And that's a dangerous game because not only are we not working together, it has become near impossible for business owners, particularly your audience, spiritual business owners who are just getting started, who don't have the ability to hire the 8 or 9 or 10 or 20 specialized service providers they need. They're being asked, it's becoming demanded of them that they know all of these things. And so now what's your job exactly? Like, you started your business to be a coach, or you started your business to deliver a service like healing services, whatever it might be. Now you have to learn bookkeeping, and you have to learn Facebook ads, and you have to learn web design, and you have to learn videography, and you have to learn how to present on camera, and you have to learn how to build websites and landing pages. You have to understand funnels. You have to get group insurance. Like, you have to do all this stuff. And it's just tremendously overwhelming, especially when we're all trying to do it ourselves. And so I believe a few things. The first is that this specialized economy is not going to last. We are going to return to a time where there are larger organizations that employ specialists. Like, I believe that the specialists are not going to remain solopreneurs forever. They're going to join a team. It's going to be a team like mine. It's going to be larger organizations that end up consuming the smaller ones. Something's going to happen. The pendulum is going to swing, and specialists are going to have an opportunity to actually do what they love again. It's just not going to be on their own. It's not sustainable. They're going to work for a visionary or a leader or a manager they believe in. Now,
Mhm.
what I have done as an interim, or I don't know, maybe I'll become one of those bigger organizations, I'm not quite sure, time will tell, is I have chosen to hire most of the specialists that are necessary, and we continue to hire and grow as we scale, that these solopreneurs, coaches, consultants, information product service providers, seminar leaders, etc., would ultimately need to hire or try to figure out on their own. So Measurable Genius is a polymathic organization led by a polymath who hires specialists. Ironically enough, I have I have Facebook ads specialists, copywriters, videographers, front-end web developers, IT support people, etc., so that my clients can come to me and we can deliver the ultimate result, which is the funnel that actually produces discovery calls, or the marketing machine that actually produces new leads that turn into great customers, instead of the business owner having to try to manage that process themselves, because it's literally impossible, and many will still try, but the frustration is real. And so we attempt to solve that problem. Each of those services on their own is now a commodity. But at Measurable Genius, because those services are managed and our clients have a single strategic conversation, we provide the business coaching and the strategic advisory necessary to bring all those things together. We put a plan together, we build the system, and then we produce the result. That's my objective.
Awesome. And how can people reach you if they're interested in getting coaching from you or anything like that?
Sure. So first and foremost, the best way to go about doing that directly would be measurablegenius.com, spelled MEASURABLE, genius.com. That is my website for my business. All you can do there is sign up to come to one of my quarterly events or book a discovery call with me. If people are interested in consuming my content or learning from me, I have produced hundreds of videos, and we've done our clients and our audience the favor of building another platform called measurablegenius.tv, which is basically Measurable Genius YouTube. Every video that I've ever produced is on there, organized by category. It's searchable. You can find a ton of valuable information. I've produced, I don't know, something like 60, 70, or 80 weekly shows. There's 150 episodes of my video blog. There's videos on just about every topic you can imagine as it relates to digital marketing, human behavior, leadership, business development, strategy, systems, etc.
Awesome. Well, when you were talking about specialists, it reminded me of a joke I remember hearing about specialists and generalists. So the specialist is somebody who learns more and more about less and less until he knows practically everything about nothing. And then the generalist is somebody who learns less and less about more and more until he knows practically nothing about everything.
Yeah, that's exactly right. And the real magic is when those two people work together and meet in the middle.
Right, right. So I'm curious though, because a lot of the problem that bigger companies seem to be having is that with how rapidly everything is changing, and Facebook is just one example. It's like you get your whole system set up, and then they change everything, and then everybody's scrambling to adapt. And it seems like with our digital economy, everything is just exponentially increasing in terms of how rapidly everything is changing. And these bigger companies are just so slow to change because they have all these moving parts that have to come into agreement to make any kind of a change. And so a lot of these smaller companies are very nimble and can make these quick changes and adapt. So when you were talking about these solopreneurs kind of coming together into these groups, do you see that there's sort of a peak size maybe that these groups will come to, so that they're just big enough to have specialists who can really dive in deeply to these different areas, but they stay small enough to stay nimble, to be relevant?
Yeah, I mean, you can build a $10 million business with, I'm imagining, like, if we have clients, they join us doing, a million, maybe a little more than a million, maybe less. They could have two or three people doing the $1 million plus measurable genius, right? And then, to get to 10 million, maybe all they need is 10 or 20 people plus a great consultancy like us. Like, I don't think you need to have like some people have this ridiculous ambition. Like, I'm going to build a $50 million company. I'm going to build $100 million company. I'm going to go make $1 billion by the time I'm 40. It's just, most people should probably just reality check that. Like, wouldn't it be great to make $400,000 or $500,000 a year with almost no overheads? Like, most people probably couldn't even they could spend $500,000 a couple years in a row. And by the time they've bought a couple properties and they're traveling to a few different destinations a year and they're doing the work that they love to do, how much more is there to buy? Really? You know what I'm saying?
Right.
So I think that the first and most important step is for the business owner to decide, like, what scale do they really want to achieve so that the business doesn't turn into a monster and take over their life, right?
Good question.
And if we focus on that, the question is, like, how big do you really need to get? But if you're going to employ every specialist you need on your own marketing team in-house, you need to have a team of 30, 40, 50 people, right? By the time you include your operations, your actual fulfillment, and then the marketing team, that's a fairly big company. And if you're producing like $150,000 per person in gross revenue, which is the average Fortune 500 production rate per employee, I'm just going to quickly do some math here. For 50 people doing $150,000 a year is $7.5 million in gross sales. That's a fairly big company. Not a lot of companies do 8 million. 0.4% of business owners ever make it past $1 million. How many do you think make it to 8?
Wow.
You know what I'm saying? So
I didn't realize it was that small.
Oh, it's tremendously small. So, I mean, even $1 million, can you imagine? Like, you guys taught your audience is spiritual entrepreneurs.
Mm-hmm.
I'm imagining they're doing coaching, or they're producing information products, or they're providing some kind of healing services. Healing is kind of like a service provider, so the margins are less. But let's just talk about coaching and consulting. To do $1 million in coaching revenue, or to do $1 million selling an info product, how much of a team do you really need? Right? Your margin on $1 million in that type of a business is probably between 60 and 80%. Well, that means your take home before taxes is like $600,000 to $800,000. Is that not enough for most people?
Right.
You know what I'm saying? So I think it's just a matter of perspective. I think there's a lot of headline reading that goes on. And I think there's a lot of people that identify as entrepreneurs, or that they claim that big organizations are failing because they either are a big organization with really terrible managers, or they're an employee turned entrepreneur who has been led by terrible managers. And the reality is that if you've decided you're unemployable because you had a couple bad managers, I would love to just share with you that it's a lot harder to build a business than it would be to find a really great manager who believes in you, who's willing to pay you 180, 160, 140, $120,000 a year for your services as a specialist. And you'd earn that income a whole lot quicker than if you try to build a business that'll fund you out that same amount of net cash flow.
That's a really good point.
Like, I just think that people don't think those things through very carefully.
Well, and speaking about money, Alexander, I know a lot of the people we deal with in the spiritual entrepreneur field do encounter money difficulties, and I'm sure you've heard this a lot from people. But particularly in the spiritual field, why do you think so many people who are deeply spiritual also encounter lack of abundance issues?
They don't value themselves enough.
Simple. Yeah. Okay.
I mean, that's a reality. There's two main reasons why people don't accumulate wealth or don't consistently produce income. The first is they carry guilt and shame, and their perceptions of guilt and shame inhibit the actions necessary to produce wealth, because Guilt and shame lower self-worth. And so then conversely, and I'm just on the other side of the coin here, I could just say equivalently, they don't appreciate themselves enough, and they don't see truly the value in the product or the service they sell if they themselves are the product.
Good point. And the other thing that's interesting too is that there seems to be this cultural dichotomy between spirituality and wealth building, because there are so many references that the meek will inherit the earth, and it's better to be poor and give all your money away, and do service to your creator and things like that. So I find that a lot of times spiritual people have a hard time justifying receiving money for what they do. In fact, I've actually heard people specifically say, oh, this healing ability is a gift and it should be given away freely. So I think it's hard for people to make that transition. So I can totally understand like the guilt and shame. They probably feel some guilt in terms of accepting money for what they do.
Yeah, the interesting thing though is that programming was written by people who think that they're better at managing money than the people they're talking to.
Right.
Okay, so they have an incentive. Like, who do they think the money's being given to? The people saying that stuff to begin with.
Right.
So like let's just break that down. Like, people who believe that they're better at managing resources will tell people who they think are poor at managing resources to give them their resources.
Like the government, perhaps.
Right. Now, those who are better at managing resources than the government often find creative ways to avoid giving the government their resources, don't they?
Right. Exactly.
Now, do you not think that system is set up so that those people can win? Like the government, like the rules are literally, you can go into any country on the planet and you can dig through the tax codes, and you will find that if you demonstrate prudent management of money, they reward you by taking less of your money.
Good point.
That's just straight up how it works. You can also see that religious institutions and spiritual institutions believe that their message is worth sharing enough that they're asking their followers to give them money to help share it.
Mm-hmm.
That's true.
Okay. Now, also, let's just investigate this for a second. If it's better to give than receive, the person receiving is a sinner. So how do you give to someone if they don't pay for it without making them a sinner in the process? These are all paradoxes.
Mm-hmm.
Right.
So the reality is that it's fine. You want to give your service away for free. You think you've received a gift. You don't see what you've given to earn it then. And there's an exercise you can do for that. How did I earn this gift? What have I already paid for it? So therefore, why should I be paid? Like these are imbalanced, incomplete perceptions. And they're built on a platform which is largely moral. It's not real. And furthermore, if your gift is meant to be shared, how do you sustainably share it? And how do you scale it without magnifying it with money?
Mm-hmm.
So, I mean, if we were to sit any of these people down, like we could clear these issues fairly quickly. They just haven't had someone with certainty help them either dissolve the apparent paradoxes or delusions, or help them see the reality of their circumstance, or dissolve their guilt and shame. I mean, it's one of those things.
Mm-hmm.
So would any of the Rockefeller habits help them? Because I know that's an interesting area that you've delved into and you teach a lot about.
Sure. So the Rockefeller Habits is a book written by Vern Harnish. It's a series of rhythms, disciplines, and frameworks to help a business owner or entrepreneur become a scaling growth firm in their industry. Largely, it would tangentially help in this process because it would force the business owner to become more organized, and therefore they would attract more resources, right? In reality, like you're not scaling a business if you don't truly value your service enough to sell it. So I think that I would want to resolve the issue inhibiting someone from selling before we start talking about scaling. You need to be able to take money for the service in a way that's sustainably going to empower you to fund your own growth. If you can't fund your own growth on the revenue you produce, you are dependent on others to fund your growth, which means you're either borrowing money or you're asking venture capitalists to give you money, and you're carving away your asset called the business, neither of which are appealing to me. So I think it's an important first step that a business owner figures out a way to price their services that equips them to fund their investment in growing their firm. You have to be able to pay for your own growth, otherwise you're not going to scale a business.
That's such a good point. I remember going through that transition early on because in my early studies in metaphysics, I was surrounded by a lot of people who insisted that the highest path was to volunteer your time and services. But then I found myself always having to work some other job that was unrelated to what I really wanted to be doing and giving to the world. And then in part time I would be teaching and working on developing my own self and things like that. So I made a decision at some point. I just decided, like what you're talking about, I need to invest in what I'm doing here. And so in order to be able to do that, and somehow I need to be able to monetize what I'm doing so that I can support myself while I'm doing this. And then instead of working some other completely unrelated job, everything that I'm doing can be in alignment with what I really want to give to the world, and then receive that payment.
Yeah, good decision. Like, isn't it ironic? Like, yeah, volunteer during the day, work a part-time job by night. Like, when your vocation and vacation have become the same, you've begun to master your life.
And so, Alexander, earlier, I think one of the key points you were talking about is that for some reason, our behavior often does not match what our true interests are or our true desires.
No, what we think are our true desires is what I said.
Oh,
Your behavior is your true desires. That's the great paradox. Like, even in how you just asked me the question, that's the mistake that everybody makes. Is what they say is, my behavior doesn't match what I truly want. And your behavior demonstrates what you truly want. What you think you want has not been connected to what you truly want, because you're so busy condemning what your behavior demonstrates. You're not it's a backwards formula. If you don't recognize and honor what your behavior demonstrates you want, then you're not going to acknowledge what your true desires are. So then how can you link anything new to your true desires if you're so busy rejecting it?
Wow, that's very, very powerful. And I know we were talking about diving deeper into that, so this would be a good point. So when people are finding that their thoughts in terms of what they say they want and their actions in terms of what they are actually doing are incongruent, what would you recommend? How do you recommend people reconcile that?
I would recommend that they first do what's called a value determination process, which you can do on Dr. John Demartini's website. So if you go to Dr. Demartini, DrDemartini.com, and then click on that page, there's something is going to say values. You sign up, do a values determination. What it's going to ask you is 13 questions, which he calls value determinants. And these determinants ask you to look at basically the resources that you've accumulated in your life through your behavior instead of what you think your behavior should be. So, for example, how do you actually spend your money? How do you actually invest your time? How do you actually fill your space? Where do you automatically express order and organization? Not where should you be ordered and organized, where are you already? There's 13 of these questions, and what it's going to help you do is reveal what your behavior has demonstrated is important from a resource accumulation perspective. And it's going to give you then a hierarchy. In my case, the top of my hierarchy is business strategy, marketing communication, right? Like the things that I'm incredibly focused on. I fill my space literally with employees. I spend my time having this type of a conversation, doing strategy conversations with my clients, leading my team, right? How am I actually spending my time? I value those things. Then what you can do is you can say, okay, great. Wealth didn't show up in my values. Exercise didn't show up in my value, whatever it might be for you. And then you can ask the following question. How will this thing that I think I want, but I don't have yet, whatever it might be, and I'll use the example, I exercise every day, but a lot of people might set a goal like I need to exercise, okay? So you take exercise and you take your values hierarchy. So maybe family is at the top of your list of values, or your spiritual connection is at the top of your values. What you can do is say, how will exercise help me fulfill my value and benefit my desire to be spiritual and to spend time with my family? Okay? And by connecting those topics together, by taking what's actually important and connecting it to the new subject matter, you're going to create links in the mind. And the glial cells in the brain literally light up and they begin to form new neural pathways, new grooves in the brain that take what are apparently disconnected concepts and put them together. And to the degree you can take what you think you want and demonstrate to your own mind how it's going to help you fulfill what you're already demonstrating is important to you, you will increase the probability of doing it.
That is so powerful.
That is the manifestation formula. If you want wealth, link it to your values, not the values you think you should have, the values you actually have. The problem here is most people are trying to please authorities. Most people are trying to please mom and dad. They're trying to please their employees. They're trying to please their customers. They're trying to please other people. They're trying to please their girlfriend. And so they're condemning their values. They're condemning their behavior. And that makes it very challenging to want to recognize and honor them. So you have to tell the truth. It's step number one, drop the fantasy, step out of the shadows and stand on the shoulders of giants instead.
Cool. I love bringing the biology into it because part of my background is in physics and biology. And I feel like it's important for people to understand that we are in an animal body. It's like we have this consciousness. This is greater than the body, but we also have to deal with these biological factors like what you're talking about, that when people are trying to change a habit, for example, they need to understand that you've actually created a neural pathway there. The neurons have grown closer together to create an efficient path for that particular thought in action. And so you actually have to redirect your attention long enough for that pathway to atrophy to really be able to change a habit. So that's some really important stuff you're talking about.
100%. And there's a way you can actually deconstruct those pathways if you want. It's just, they're opposite questions. Like, how is this thing I'm doing a drawback to my values? Your brain will demyelinate. You can accelerate that process. We can cure it. We can, quote unquote, caveat, I'm not a doctor, lawyer, therapist. Don't go and do this.
Right.
But I mean, we can cure some of the strongest addictions in less than 24 hours.
Wow.
Cured, walk away, different person.
So I can't remember the name. He's an Australian metaphysician who taught about the 21-day challenge that in his belief and experience was it takes 21 days to change a habit. And you're saying you could do something in 24 hours. So
I could do it in an hour. If you're sitting right in front of me, I could do it in an hour. It depends on how strong the addiction is and how difficult the patient is. But I mean, if we sat down for a single session, we and the participant is willing, you can come in my office. We'll spend 1 hour to 6 hours, however long it takes, and you'll walk out and it will be resolved. There's no time. Time is a function of the efficiency of the process.
That's really interesting that you say that, because I remember this quote from A Course in Miracles, and it was talking about a miracle is basically a change of perception, and the change of perception creates a change in your life. And it was
100%.
talking about how big things that we want to change are no different than little things. The process is exactly the same. So it said a big miracle is no different than a little miracle. So that's exactly what it sounds like you're saying is that you may have these big things you want to change, but that doesn't mean it has to take forever.
No, it just takes as many links as is necessary to shift the balance of the neurology.
Cool. So how can people find you once again? Because unfortunately, we're coming to the end of our show. We loved having talked to you. This has been incredibly fascinating material. But how can people reach you if they want to find you again?
Sure. So first and foremost, you can look me up on Facebook, Alexander Ford. I've got a page on there. That's where we publish most of my content. If you want to look up my content and dive into any particular subject or just get access to my full archive of video content, you can go to measurablegenius.tv. And if you want to visit my website or book a discovery call, you can go to measurablegenius.com.
Awesome. Well, Alexander, thank you so much for being with us today.
It's been incredibly fascinating. We're going to have you on again.
Thank you for having me. I appreciate it, guys.
You're welcome. Well, we love having you with us. So please connect with us on Facebook at Spirits Journey Radio. Be sure to like our page so that you can be part of our life and we can be part of yours. You can study with us or get a reading with us at intuitiveschool.com. This has been Spirit's Journey on Truth Frequency Radio, simulcast on Oneness Talk Radio. I'm Patrick.
And I'm Catherine. We'll see you next week.
Goodbye for now.